Hello, and welcome to the second edition of this special CoinDesk Live Internet 2030 series, where we're examining the future of the decentralized web. Yesterday, we heard from Juan Binet and Colin Everin of Filecoin and Joe Lubin of ConsenSys. Today, we're going to hear from John Wolpert of ConsenSys, Brendan Eich of Brave, Brian Bellendorf of Hyperledger and the Linux Foundation, and Bradley Kam of Unstoppable Domains. I'm Daniel Kuhn. I'm a features reporter with CoinDesk, and I'm glad you're here. Please welcome my colleague, Ben Schiller.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Schiller. I'm the features editor here at CoinDesk. Just a couple of notes of housekeeping. You can ask questions of any of the panelists in the stream right here or on Twitter using the hashtag Internet2030. And just one other thing, as well as the live sessions here, we're also publishing a series of interviews and op-eds and features about the Internet in 2030, and you'll be able to see those on the site throughout the month. So hopefully you'll check in and check those out. So I just wanted to talk about, why we're all here. I mean, there seems to be a reason for that, which is that the internet is not what it could be or what we hoped it would be. And, I remember a little bit about the 90s and when people had enormous amount of hopefulness and sort of optimism about this medium. And somehow along the way, we've been sort of inundated with mass surveillance and sort of data manipulation and misinformation and monopoly. And we've gone from this kind of dream of the internet to something that's not, it's more like a nightmare. So my first question was really for Brian. How did we get here? I mean, how did we go from this kind of dream of the 1990s to the kind of cesspit that we have today?
Yeah, it's really tempting to say that, everything turned out as best you could be expected. It's just, people are lousy and this is why we can't have nice things. But it's got to be deeper than that. I think there is this unbridled kind of enthusiasm in the 90s for connecting people to information and to each other. I mean, we forget when information was hard to find, when you had to pick up this dumb yellow big book to look up a phone number for a pizza place to order pizza, right? Although in retrospect, that's kind of easier than other things. The fact that there's the death of distance. You can now be best friends with somebody on the other side of the planet and talk with them for 3 hours a day for no extra cost, right? It would be hundreds of dollars a day in phone bills before. So we got so enthused about that we started to accelerate, access to technology and access to bandwidth as a first principle, almost as a human right, as an unalloyed good. In fact, I even chose today to wear my t-shirt from the One Laptop Per Child project, which if you remember was all about, creating the really cheap $100 laptop that could be fanned out and given to everybody. And something, so I think we didn't stop to think about how could these things be weaponized? How could these things lead to, I mean, I remember all of us saying at the time, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And that's why the internet is such a good thing. I think a lot of us who were technologists building at the time were building for very peer-based kinds of networks, varying protocols that even though we had concepts of servers and clients, we're still about kind of those as equals, sharing information rather than all of us feeding into the giant cloud. And I think that's where things kind of went south, was the aggregation of power, the aggregation of centralization. Almost that became its unalloyed good, where free software came to be confused with free services as an unalloyed good, right? But free services create this dependency relationship that open source software, free software never did, right? In fact, in many ways was an antidote to. So that's almost like the original sin, perhaps, and maybe advertising was the original sin, and I'll take some fault for that, having put the first ad banner online and apologizing for that ever since. But I think if we get back to that decentralized notion, building protocols that really equal things out, realizing where we did get it right with SMTP and HTTP, but where there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and just stopping, no longer trying to think about the big server in the sky as the true north for what we should be building, but the opposite of that.
Right. Brendan, maybe you could talk a little bit about the ad-supported business model, which is dominant on the internet today. I mean, what impact did that have, and why did you choose to sort of focus on that problem?
I was going to say some amount of guilt, but the real issue is, older than JavaScript. It goes back to cookies and before them images. And it was inevitable, and we weren't even thinking about the third-party tracking problem, which is the problem where you have all these embedded tags in your page that come from vendors you've never had a relationship with, and they sort of build profiles on you and extract wealth and cheat each other and cheat the publishers. And this is a social problem and a political problem. So people have taken steps as end users to defend themselves by using tracking protection. And I'll use that instead of ad blocking, because ad blocking has become a bit of a racket in some ways. And even big companies like Google talk about the Coalition for Better Ads as a pseudo standard, or they pay the owner of AdBlock Plus, the extension that's most popular, annual fees to allow certain ads through. And that means that the tracking is always allowed in those extensions by default. You have to turn on the so-called easy privacy feature. But what's happened in the last few years, and Brave was ahead of the curve here, is you've seen a rising consciousness of privacy around the world on the part of lead users, the very valuable intransigent minorities that drive markets in new directions. You've seen it in the regulators finally, or at least the regulations, let's say, like the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, and the California Privacy Act and its sequel that's coming through this year. This rising tide of consciousness that I think comes from the users first and comes from the lead users most is not going away, and it's going into law. And there's a companion legal effort I think you alluded to when you mentioned monopolies, which is antitrust, and that's also rising. It's coming back awake or alive in the U.S. So there's something is new and different now that makes people want to put privacy perfume on a pig, and even say that they're doing privacy right, even though they're part of this ad tech system. There's a brand value to it, and that's new, right? Zuckerberg said, I think 10 years ago or so, nobody cares about privacy, and then last year he says Facebook keeps you private, right? A slight twist on the phrase, where of course whatever privacy they're ensuring, Facebook's inside the barrier with you. So Brave is taking the point of view that you should use your endpoint software as your first line of defense, because that's where all your personal data originates. That's where all your clicking and searching and querying happens. And if you can maximize the benefit of that data and protect it from being exfiltrated through these third-party tags, then you can change the world. And so we're in our 5-year mission. I guess we're getting a series extension, unlike Star Trek. We're still going, still growing.
Right. John, what's the original sin for you? Where did it go wrong? John? Is John here?
I'm here, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Mute button. With small kids in the house, you got to mute button is your friend. Where to go wrong? Humans, I think, is probably the start. I don't know. I was reminded of the eminent Barlow, John Perry Barlow's thoughts on in the early days of the web, not the internet, right? The internet was 1969, 3 years after I was born. We're talking the web, right? Most people think of the 90s as the web. And in the web, the Cyberspace Manifesto, all these things, we were fairly anarchic and fairly excited about all that stuff. And I don't know, what is the millennial version of yuppies, right? Because, the hippies became yuppies. What do the millennials become? I don't know that I think that blockchain is going to free us from our human tendencies to do this stuff to each other. I think that we have to probably just learn to be better at being humans, and then the technology will follow. So I don't know that there's a technical solve for this.
So do you think we were over reliant on technology and over believing in its ability to improve everything?
Look, the internet is beautifully decentralized in almost every way. I mean, you've got DNS and you got some things there, but it scales because it doesn't hold state, but it is, anybody can have a web server up. And then we all decided that we couldn't aggregate focus, and you need state for that. And so people provided state. The problem is that laws of physics, last I checked, don't solve for scaling state. So you don't get the internet of state. You just don't, right? So you're going to have to rely on somebody to provide your memory. If you don't want to just have a bunch of, yeah, it'd be great if everybody had their own super cool tech gear in their house, but that's not how people tend to work. They have other things to, focus on. So people are going to step up and say, hey, I'm going to help you with that. And then they're going to provide, that's going to generate some control for them. And we're back to human shenanigans.
Right. Bradley, do you want to chime in?
So I have maybe a slightly more hopeful view here. In the case of DNS, for example, we have centralized servers, and as a result of that system, we have all kinds of weird censorship of the internet. And domain names are kind of like early identifiers for users on the internet. But then you've got all kinds of weird stuff because you've got companies and as a result, governments in control of those things. So, for example, France.com had been owned by a particular individual since 1994, and France, the country, decided that they wanted it. So they took it, and now he's suing, and there's a big giant hubbub over this. When the Libyan government changed their policies in, I think it was 2013 or something like that, it became like a religious country. They started imposing morality on the .ly registry. So if you were a Canadian company with a considered immoral website, it could get taken down. And so all kinds of things like this exist with the current internet, and that's on the domain side as well as on the hosting side. And I think blockchains can absolutely provide an alternative there, where yes, even you may be relying on technology providers if the technology providers are giving you custody. And I think this is kind of the key thing about crypto in general: custody of your money, custody of your assets, custody of your data. If you have that, then the net effect is that these companies can't turn you off, even if they are providing you services. Just like your self-custody wallet can't take your money away from you. And I do think that that's a fundamental power shift on the internet that does have. I don't want to overstate the potential there, but I think there is a potential to free humanity here. And I think that the size of the problem is actually quite large. Freedom House has assessed that 2/3 of the internet users in the world do not experience a free internet. So this is a majority of humanity type problem, and I'm optimistic. I think at least by 2030, I think we should be seeing a lot of this stuff in production.
Great, Brian. Are you broadly optimistic about 2030 in terms of the internet, or are you pessimistic? I mean, where do you come down on that?
Well, I mean, optimism has been a survival strategy for many of us for the last few years. I don't know that you can really stay in this industry or stay committed to working on open standards, working on open source software, working in this domain without having an optimistic view of the potential for the technology and the potential for humanity to appropriately adapt to it. So I don't know if you're seeing like pre-survivor bias when you ask people like us if you're going to be optimistic about 2030, but I kind of can't help it be, but it's certainly going to be a hard road. And I don't know that the answer is purely algorithmic governance, which I think is a recurring theme in a lot of the cryptocurrency community, nor is it obviously, the heavy-handed, states stepping down and dictating everything. I think interestingly enough, I think the domain name system, as imperfect as it is, and I don't know the France.com situation, but I've got some opinions about the Libya situation. I wouldn't have ever taken a .ly domain. I think despite these awards, the domain name system in ICANN is about as good as we've gotten when it comes to figuring out how to do global minimum viable, as I've started to use the term governance on something that's really core. The internet would not work without a unified DNS system, right? It wouldn't work if Bellendorf.com went to two different places depending on how you asked it, and one of those was out of my control. So in those few things that we need to agree upon, the CA browser form is perhaps the second best example, even though that's also had some big challenges, and we know how broken the TLS system from a trust point of view is. But we need to fine tune those kinds of institutions. Those are going to be better as pathways to figure out how we manage the governance of technology systems going forward than defaulting it to the ITU and the UN, or saying it's purely about hash power and hash power makes right.
I might separate out a couple of issues here because I think that they often get conflated. I think one is around name collision, and I think name collision as a concept is something that DNS and ICANN have done a great job at. And I think that is an important thing for us to be able to function on the internet. But I think that we could probably all agree that DNS architecture, having been built in the 80s, is quite outdated. And that we would benefit from having a system that was user controlled. And that doesn't mean that human governance can't still come to decisions on what browsers should resolve, et cetera, et cetera. But giving ourselves a system where governments can just come in and take domains and turn down websites, I think is quite dangerous. And I can give you probably 1,000 more examples, but one not so long ago was the .cat registry, which was being used by the Catalonian independence movement. And the .cat registry was shut down by the Spanish government, and they raided the offices and put the CTO on trial for sedition. And had that architecture been on a blockchain, that hole would not have existed. And if we as a society believe that it's morally right, we could have been resolving those websites and browsers, et cetera. So
There still might have been a sedition charge and trial and so on.
it does not stop the state from putting you in prison. Absolutely not. What it
Here's
does,
my
though,
blockchain. Here's my gun.
what it does though is it allows you to publish. It does not say what happens to you after you publish, for sure.
Brendan, how does setting up a new web browser help break through this problem?
A couple of things. One is the browsers get captured by the big network superpowers, the monopolies or duopolies. These things emerge. You know, monopolies happen in nature. They happen in markets. They're not illegal per se in the US. Sherman and Clayton Act says you can't abuse monopoly power in one market to take over an adjacent or new market, which is what Microsoft got convicted of in US v. Microsoft. And what Google, in my opinion, will probably be convicted of, or they'll settle first. So, you know, there's always this problem with networks forming superpowers or power nodes. You could say even with DNS, you're seeing Cloudflare have a lot of power, right? And they're doing clever, you know, layer violation hacks on it, which is also good network engineering in my experience, but can lead to even more power. I'm not saying that Cloudflare is a monopoly. So people neglect the browser, the endpoint, the user's first line of defense, as I said earlier. And that's because it does get captured by the businesses that get built up and ultimately become very wealthy, often monopolies on the server side. So what if you had a business that aligned its interest with its users of endpoint software? That's what Brave's trying to do. We're not keeping data in the clear on our servers. We're not doing any data collection or personal data processing. We're using anonymity tech. We're using, you know, blind signature cryptography, David Chow's cryptography. We're using more advanced and exotic things on new blockchain projects we're doing, like, you know, zero knowledge proofs and multi-party computing and so on. This is underexplored area of giving everybody a little platoon to have power through common protocols. And eventually you can imagine somebody gets too big in this space and starts corrupting things, and you have to do something to move on to the next space. But I do agree with John that there's a human problem you cannot solve with technology. But we have not used all the technical tools available. I remember reading Chown's stuff a long time ago. I had friends at the Zero Knowledge Systems company, Austin Hills company. And you know, the cypherpunk vision still lives and burns in our hearts. So that's what Brave is working on. We're trying to empower users from the edge against the central services powers.
Great. John, does the cypherpunk vision still burn within your soul? Are we expecting to see that in the future?
Well, you got to remember, I started on Team Fabric, right? You know, when it comes to where I'm at in my perspective on this, I have to say it's some peril, because my original family was the Hyperledger Fabric family. You know, one of the best days of 2016, if I may say in front of Brian's face, was when Brian joined that effort. You know, that was a big win. And so but I have been known to, hopefully in a good humored way, take some pot shots at my old work when it comes to, you know, private permissioned shared databases is what I call them. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. Shared databases are a good thing. shared state machines, you might be more refined to say. And I like GitHub. GitHub is one of those. So I mean, it's lots of utility in shared state machine, or Git, I should say. The transition over to public blockchain for me wasn't to say, hey, let's put all of our business logic and data on a public blockchain, which is even harder to compartmentalize information around. And at the end of the day, I was talking to an organizer of a big supply chain organization that's on private permission blockchain. And he said, well, we're doing it for transparency. And I said, really? Are you really? Because I'm pretty sure you work with Homeland Defense. And I'm pretty sure you guys don't want everybody in the world knowing where all of our food is. He's like, no, that's not what we want. I'm like, yeah, okay, then you don't want transparency. You want carefully controlled compartmentalization. You want the counterparties that need to know what each other are doing to know what each other are doing and have verifiable proof that my purchase order is the same as your purchase order. You know, that when I sent you a purchase order, you have the same data I did. You didn't fat finger it. You didn't have it put it in a spreadsheet and goof it up. That you didn't can't say that you didn't get the memo, that sort of thing. But you don't want to. How on earth were we so good in 2015 when we got gotten onto this whole blockchain idea to convince CISOs and CIOs and CTOs that putting their data carefully defended, 80% of which is very, very sensitive data, on a new threat surface where the stupidest administrator in your consortium is going to give you all a bad day when they got hacked by Mr. Robot. I don't know. That's a pretty good sell. To me, you'd say, no, hey, there's the blockchain is not a database. This is where I've come to is make it do less. It's an ordering and state management, or it's a hash management and ordering service that serves traditional systems of record, SAP, Oracle, DB2, what have you, Mongo, Neo4j. And that, you know, that's where, you know, you say, I've got a record. We call this baselining. It's a standard. It's not a product. It's not a platform. It's not a coin. It's not a chain. It's not a token. It's just a technique that says, hey, we're all going to use three prong plugs and you know, 220 volts. It's a standard under the OASIS standards body. And we're saying, you know, we're all going to do a few things and implement a few basic interfaces the same way so that when I send you a record, we are baseline. That record is verifiably identical between the two of us. And we're going to use an always on tamper resistant public blockchain in such a way that anybody looking at that wouldn't know anything was happening at all. So you have perfect compartmentalization on a record by record basis, a workflow step by workflow step basis, but you don't have to set up a new integration bus every time you have a new partner. That's where I'm at.
John, I'd like to dig in a little bit to what you were just saying. You've said in the past that if we stop trying to make blockchain do everything, it could be involved in almost everything. So where do you see blockchain actually fitting into the internet of 2030?
Yeah, ordering and hash management. I mean, that would be the wonky technical way of putting it is you deposit proofs from off-chain zero knowledge. That's the way Baseline does, at least right now. And actually there's some argument about which way you need to do that. And, because we're trying to be minimally viable, you know, you try to do as little as possible or prescribe as little as possible in the specification. So you can use any set of, you know, right now, like NATS is a messaging protocol that's being used in it. You can use anything else if you wanted. You can baseline a Fabric system. You could baseline an Oracle system. And yeah, there's some naming to it. I think we picked a good name with baseline because it's verbable. I'd like a verb finally. I lost a big to Uber in a previous company I was running, and they got the verb, and so I think the universe owes me a verb. Yeah, send me that purchase order and make sure to baseline it. And that's, you know, it's just a way of saying, hey, we all understand what that means, and what it really means is that your record and my record have a proof that we can be certain we've broken the two generals problem, not the Byzantine generals, the two generals problem in terms of the messaging issue. And we know for sure that your record and my record are the same, that the work step that follows from that must adhere to the rules of the previous work step, or it cannot generate its proof. And in doing that is very simple, right? So you can use that as a key and a key value lookup system. And you can use that in maintaining the integrity of large, complicated workflows without having everybody know everything about everybody else's work step. You can have a shipper that has its work step that may not know anything about a previous work step, but they know that everything coming in and out has integrity. So you can get some pretty cool stuff out of a very simple thing, which is have an always on state machine that everybody's using. It doesn't have to be fast. It doesn't have to be that terribly scalable. Need a little more scale, but not a lot. And use it in such a way that if you had a supremely good AI and you were training it on that ledger, as it were, it would tell no tales. It wouldn't tell you anything about my relationships with you or my business activities or how things are going, or even Poisson distribution stuff like cadences. So just ordering and hash management. You put some hashes on it in a clever way, and you use it for ordering of workflows. Sequencing, like purchase orders shouldn't all calculate against the same state. Like if you're doing a discount rate table, first purchase orders for 100 units, second purchase order needs to calculate from 101, and third from whatever. You can't have them all calculate from 0. That leads to things like revenue recognition issues. So having a system that just says, I know for sure all of these purchase orders came one after the other. Simple as that.
It's good to have a simple ambition. I met Scott Sornetta the other year, and Haber and Sornetta were just concerned about tamper-proof timestamped ordering, and that would be a big win to have at scale in markets and among businesses. Brave's looking at this. We have to use more sophisticated proof systems that we're building because we're dealing with multiple parties. Like the three-sided bat logo indicates, we have to deal with advertisers and publishers as well as users, and we want them to be able to verify the proofs themselves. So without re-identifying users or seeing deterministic user data, anything that could fingerprint the user, we want them to be able to make sure that they got the right ads through to the right audience, that they got the right payments through, things like that. But these are sometimes just three-party or custom payments protocols, and we're building on existing building blocks like Aztec where we can. It's great to have this community. I thought maybe since somebody was sort of giving some shade to Ethereum in talking about state is hard to share at scale, because it is. But I think I agree with John. You can do a lot with a slower chain to get the ordering you need. You can do fast things on side chains. We are surprised. I know the Solana folks, and they're stepping up to work with us to port our Themis next-gen ad system to Solana. So if they pull it off well, maybe that's our side chain or our proof of authority chain we're hoping for. We don't have the ability to go directly on chain on Ethereum for several reasons I can get into, but speed is certainly one of them.
I just want to remind watchers that may have just joined that you could send questions over Twitter using the hashtag Internet2030. We started off the discussion talking about at least some of the current problems with the internet stem from being built with the available technologies of the time. How can we be certain that the decentralized web we're building today won't run into similar issues? Maybe Brian could respond to that.
I don't think you can almost tautologically, you can't anticipate unexpected outcomes, right? What you can try to do is make sure that as you're all working together on common technologies, you're all just vigorously talking about those outcomes. And I see that happening in the blockchain space. I see not just the conferences and that sort of thing, but a lot of intense conversation about what are the ethics of what we're building here. Sometimes I feel like I don't see it enough. Like I don't know that the DeFi community really honestly admits that it's a casino as much as they perhaps should, or at least talks about perhaps the way that it would have an impact beyond just folks trying to kind of game systems for better outcomes. Because up to the outside world, they see the blockchain community a lot as that. A lot of folks who are very inward facing, asking, can they come up with a new technology to mint another coin to go and exit and buy a Lamborghini? That's a perception issue, right? But it's not one that's uninformed. And so I think part of it has to be, we need to show impact. What pulled me into this space long ago before joining Hyperledger was land titles in emerging markets. right? The ability to rigorously show this individual has claim to this property, and it can't simply be erased by a bureaucrat changing an entry in a paper record or a digital record. It turned out as many countries were digitizing their land record systems, they became easier to corrupt, because you and I know if you have admin rights to a database, you can absolutely make it look like that record was always, something else, back to time immemorial. So we still haven't seen that. We still haven't really seen blockchain technology used to help reinforce auditability of government systems and oversight, accounting systems, that sort of thing, at least in ways that has made an impact to the public. The word blockchain right now is super in the dumpsters. I hate to say it. So many people are using DLT, when they want to stand apart from it. And I think that perception issue alone is enough to stymie a lot of folks who might actually consider using this technology for some piece of public good. The second is, I think we just have to figure out alternatives to proof of work as quickly as possible, because you don't have to be a Californian to know that climate change is real, and that burning CPU power as a proxy for political power in a dynamic system is just, immoral to so many of the people in this space. And so we got to move past that. It worked, it had its time, but there's got to be other ways to forge consensus amongst consenting parties on a network, right? And we know that there are, and I'm really glad that Ethereum is moving partly in that direction, although it's still hybrid POS, POW as I understand it. But if we can shed those two kinds of issues, I think there's a lot of people who today aren't actually part of the party and aren't applying this to the right kinds of applications that we need their help with.
Great. We spoke to Vitalik Buterin the other day, and he refused to sort of be drawn on what 2030 might look like, but he said, I can tell you what the forces at play might be. So I was wondering if we might talk about that here. What do you think the major sort of forces shaping the internet in 2030 will be?
Well, I think the antitrust law coming back to life in the U.S. is going to be big. It'll take a while, and you're seeing new wave politicians get on board with it. Elizabeth Warren even had a platform about breaking up big tech. I'm not sure things will go that far. I think there'll be less than meets the eye, but the innovation always goes around these monopoly gatekeepers. I agree that with critics who say Google is not innovative now. So where's the real innovation? One of the things we may think blockchain has a bad name for is still, I think, giving it a good name in some parts of the world, and that is just doing things in lieu of using fiat money and facing the usual gatekeepers. And even DeFi, which is a comical clown show in many ways, has promise because it again gets around the underbanked and unbanked restrictions. So I think that will continue to happen. It's going to be messy, but there will be, I think, political support for it because there will be enough popular support. So again, I think people power will matter. Users, especially lead users, will matter and will determine a more private and more decentralized future than the present. I'm optimistic on that. I'm a programmer by training, so I'm neurotic by nature, but I wouldn't get out of the bed in the morning if I was pessimistic about this technological trend.
So you think there'll be a reassertion of people power that will drive up from the bottom to have a more private internet?
I do, and this is in the face of nasty problems with a lot of the governments around the world. But those governments are looking, in my view, weaker over time, not stronger. And if they do go out with a bang instead of a whimper, it could be pretty ugly and could be hot war even. But let's hope not. In the meantime, I think technology and people power continue.
Great. Brad, maybe you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think that one big trend I think that we should see a lot more is user control of data, and I think that this is actually a really fundamental thing that has the potential to impact the way that technology companies and companies in general are built, because ultimately Facebook's monopoly is a data monopoly. They have our social graph, they have all of this stuff, and because they are a data monopoly, they also wind up being the arbiter of free speech. They have to decide, okay, what's okay and what's not okay. And when they do decide that, it has huge implications because you're essentially gone, quote unquote, from the internet. Same thing is happening with YouTube and all the takedowns that they're doing of content. And if you put users in control of data, then all of a sudden you can flip that to the point where a Facebook is really the UI layer that you're using in order to have a user experience. And you could have your data and you could be using 50 Facebooks. And even if one of them does ban you, there's another 49 and you're not erased from the internet entirely. And I think the same thing could happen, with applications like YouTube and others. And that switch to user control, I think, has the ability to do all sorts of things to change the technology landscape, and also to make these systems more secure. Like, there's a gigantic honeypot, at Twitter, and we saw this when Barack Obama and all these famous people got hacked. Well, if each user was controlling their own account with a private key, then you wouldn't have had, essentially every famous Twitter user all be vulnerable at the same time. They're creating these honeypots and these points of failure. So that's what makes me hopeful. We can rebuild social media and many other things if we put users back in control.
Great. Brian, do you see a sort of bottom-up upwelling?
Yeah, well, one of the most exciting things happening now is in the digital identity space, and how self-sovereign identity, which in really is really a reboot, literally a reboot of the Web of Trust model. Kudos to those who've worked at the RWOT conference to take what was really the PGP model of how signatures and encryption and stuff could work and build upon kind of a very decentralized approach, and modernizing that and updating that for using blockchain systems as the underpinning, the utility layer, and then being able to actually have that manifest as identity wallets and such. That is in production today in deployments everywhere from British Columbia for business owners to every citizen of Sierra Leone now has a digital ID as a route into a privacy-first credit bureau system, which is pretty exciting. And governments like the United States government, the Singapore government, the Japanese government, all of them are looking at digital identity systems built on self-sovereign ID now, using the technologies that this community has been pioneering, DIDs, verifiable credentials, those sorts. That is an essential piece. I think that's actually the SNTP, the email for our domain, right? If we can get that broadly adopted, it becomes easier to start to build decentralized social networks, decentralized systems for, if you want to decentralize Uber even, you've got to get to identity and all the things that hang off of identity, reputation, certification, those types of things to work in a distributed way. And I'm incredibly optimistic about where we're heading now on that front.
So I have to jump in because Brave's baseline is anonymous identity, and we're very concerned about fingerprinting risk. Like Arvind Narayanan, since he was a grad student at Stanford, is now Princeton professor, has been re-identifying users from all sorts of logs, and any high entropy log will re-identify users if you don't take really careful precautions. And so blockchains are by default public. You can do things with closing timing channels, you can use zero knowledge proofs, but at the end of the day, if we're talking about self-sovereign identity, as a cypherpunk with gray hair, I want pseudonymity, I want unlinkability, I want strong cryptographic guarantees. I don't just want to trust somebody, especially the blockchain.
If I can jump in kind, a couple, this is just pinging all sorts of neurons for me. One, I had some close hand experience of the rise of Uber, as some folks know, and people, one of the first things I was presented with when we started with Consensus was a group of students that wanted to build the decentralized Uber. And I said, so, I built a pretty good app for ride sharing, called Flywheel, and we didn't win. And we didn't win because we didn't spend billions of dollars getting everybody saying Uber at the same time. And I don't think Bill Gurley and first round would have put the money up for that if they couldn't gotten those super rents. So, but that's what matters, right? Building two-sided markets or multi-sided markets has nothing to do with the technology or whether it's decentralized or not. It has to do with the fact that you need people wanting a ride at the same time that people are offering a ride, and they all have to be on the same channel at the same time. I remember I was growing up in Michigan. I was, my dad would take us out on the boat in Lake Michigan, and we had Channel 9. I think it was the Marine Radio channel. Everybody was on that. And then we could run off to other channels to, it's like, this is the fish box WYN 54, come on channel 16, right? So you had to aggregate focus, and that kind of coordination is very costly. So how are you going to finance that, right? If everything goes, it's almost like introducing generics on the day after the pharmaceuticals spend billions of dollars building a drug. You know, introduce generics immediately. Why would anybody invest to build the new capability? So I think it's an interesting problem. I think ultimately it's what we're talking about with blockchain and distributed DLTs and such. I think it's almost like, that's 5 years. I don't know about 5 years, but 10 years from now, we're not going to be talking about blockchain if we did it right. Well, nor like it'll be like UDP. It's just in there. But I think that what's coming back now. I was at Carnegie Mellon in '84, and AI was a big deal, and then it went to the winter. But now, I mean, I don't think you can hear me clapping, right? That's AI. I think that there's a lot of business that people are really good at coming up with business models that capitalize on other people's laziness, and AI is one way that we're gonna get right. So if I can say I don't need Uber, I need a ride, and my AI can find me the ride, and I don't have to worry about branding. Maybe that's a way forward. So I think it's way extra topical.
I've been told to hurry this up a little bit and ask some harder hitting questions. So what are the problems that blockchain will not solve by the year 2030 on the internet?
Misinformation. You can take a lie and write it to a blockchain all day long. And then it's not just garbage in, garbage out. Sheila Warren says it's garbage in, garbage forever. Right. We still have a misinformation problem. It turned out the problem wasn't that we weren't sufficiently connected. It was that we could be over-connected and our communication systems could be jammed. So that'll be a big struggle. It won't necessarily solve corruption either. There's a real, as I mentioned, that was like one of my first kind of motivations for coming into this was the potential to use this as a way to hold systems of authority to account and eliminate counterparty risk and our forced trust into central systems. But you still got to have public support and even operational support for that kind of transparency. And there's some countries that have that kind of ethic in their leadership, and some countries that don't, sadly. And that we will struggle to get that out there. And likewise with companies, some companies care about being run cleanly and making an honest dollar, and some are just out to get the first one they can get.
Okay,
yeah, it's a category error to think you can get morality out of Newtonian physics, right? So what John said triggered something with me. Mark Blythe at Brown is very entertaining. Sounds like Shrek, Scottish-born professor, and he talks about the problems with financing things like Uber. Why should there be this big, multi-billion payoff for the few who created or funded or ran Uber, if it's really depending on the crowds and matchmaking for users? Can we have better ways of funding things that don't lead to these sort of inequalities that create other social problems and that often lead to information asymmetry and monopoly based on it, right? This is a problem that I don't think will be solved by blockchain. I don't. It's going to take, human action in a different category.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just follow up on the idea of this bottom-up movement reasserting privacy rights. I mean, we haven't really seen that in the last 20 odd years of the internet. I mean, people have never really taken privacy that seriously. Why do we suppose that will happen in the future?
It's happening right now. Sorry, Brian. I was just going to say Oracle today just changed how they do business in Europe because of GDPR and big fines headed their way. So things are changing. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing. I think it's a myth that people don't care about their privacy. I think often they were asked that by the very corporations who have no interest in actually helping people achieve privacy as a way to help them feel, kind of whitewash their own operations. People care quite a bit about it. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, of which I'm a board member, has seen, we were all worried about whether it's COVID-19 or the current administration or otherwise causing, kind of a darker period for this, but interest, donations, memberships, enthusiasm from our constituency are at all-time highs. And we're seeing other civil rights organizations that are digital and associated with the internet are seeing the same kind of thing. The GDPR, as flawed as it has been, was a very well-intentioned and I think actually well-designed set of laws. Where it kind of suffered has been in the implementation. It has been unevenly enforced across the states, across the European Union, and certainly not enforced outside. But it's inspired CCPA and other iterative steps that I think get us there. And ironically, blockchain technology is a better way to track what the GDPR wants, which is you want to attach, when you say, I've got this data, I have the consent from the parties who gave me that data or who are the subject of this data. I have their consent to process it. I have their consent to hand it off, and that consent is withdrawable as well. That's not something that a centralized database gets you out of the box in the same way that a decentralized system, especially one with self-sovereign ID at its core, gives you almost for free. And so I'm actually incredibly optimistic about the regulatory lines, if they do get improved and iterated upon, meeting up with the technology lines to something that makes it the default for us to build more conformant human rights respecting systems.
But haven't these monopoly companies just grown bigger as GDPR has been rolled out? I mean, if it was
being enforced,
it would have done its
that's
job.
true. And they were already growing. They were already taking over and consolidating and squeezing out all the small fry. GDPR is only being enforced in a limited way. And this is why Johnny Ryan, who I hired at Brave, has gone on and into the sort of NGO world to litigate, and not just against the big tech, but against regulators who aren't doing their jobs, right? There are regulators that are either captured, maybe in the case of the UK, for instance, or just massively underfunded, which you can't solve with blockchain, you can't solve with technology. This is a political problem.
Another question, so talking politics, how do we think the geopolitical conflict between the US and China, which obviously have very different sort of views of the internet, will affect the future of this medium? Tough question.
Yeah, I think one of the things that may be happening as part of this competition is that it's increasing the awareness of and need for decentralized web. I feel like they're basically doing marketing for us at this point. So when we see all of these big conflicts around TikTok, and for example, TikTok is an issue around TikTok stores the data on their servers. The concern is that the data of Americans is going to be going directly to the Chinese government. And so this now, that's a bigger fear for the United States now than it was 3 years ago. But each time these types of fights happen, it's essentially just an advertisement for the decentralized web. So I think as that heats up, and as companies and governments on both sides abuse their power more and more, that's going to be, there's going to be more and more desire for the antidote. I think that's already happening. I mean, the amount of friends that message me on Signal now versus maybe a year ago, I think the number might be up 2x, which is pretty astonishing. So I think that it's definitely in the zeitgeist now, and as that competition gets worse, more intense, it's only going to increase.
Well, isn't crypto littered with the dead bodies of failed projects, especially failed decentralized social media companies? Like, how can we be sure that this is actually a threat to these monolithic companies like Google or Facebook?
Yeah, fail until you succeed. Yeah, I'm looking around here, and I think we're all of a certain age, which means we've got many decades of lots of failures. And I don't want to speak
Ahead of us,
here, but
ahead of us, to be clear, ahead of us.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think that we've seen a lot of failure, and there's goodness in that, right? There's nuance, there's understanding, and you just keep on plugging until you get it right.
Yeah, Brad made the point earlier. If you could have your own sort of user software, this may not require everyone to become a Linux hacker, that mediates your social network, the sort of a gateway or a hub of your own data, then you wouldn't be dependent on a few central powers. You know, why do you go on Facebook? Why did you go on MySpace and Friendster before them? Because your friends all went there, and eventually somebody got enough scale to be the winner. If we had, you know, these protocols that are still being worked on in the Fediverse and other places, you know, for finding people independently of their data being locked up into silos, I think we'd be better off. Brave is not leaning into this because it's full of re-identification risk. It's full of risk of becoming one of those corpses that was a social blockchain play. But I think we'll get there. I think you have to get the building blocks lined up. You have to get the users aware. And you know, you can't start by saying, here is easier. It has to be much more conventional.
I mean, what is this kind of theory of adoption here? Because I mean, Brendan, you might say it's more of a consumer adoption, whereas Brian might say it's more of an enterprise adoption. I mean, who's going to do the most adopting in the next 10 years?
I mean, more power to anybody doing enterprise. And I think sentiment swings back and forth every few years, especially in the VC culture. But in the long arc of computing, it started at enterprise and you know, open source Fortran compilers for mainframes. And then it went to consumer and open source as a way of reducing costs and you know, having everything on GitHub with a single contributor license agreement that I just learned about, by the way, if you know what that is. Brian and I should talk about this sometime. But really, the arc has been toward consumer for so long that enterprise is kind of like a specialized version of consumer. And with coronavirus policy making everyone stay home, then you end up with people doing work from home in a way that is, you know, very consumerish and using tools that they might not have gotten approval from their IT department to use last year. Suddenly they're being approved. Suddenly Zoom is huge, but there will be lots of competition. So I think consumer works. I think enterprise, you can make successful businesses, but I'm betting on consumer myself.
If I could say, I think that Brian's got it right on identity, but it strikes me. I bet you would agree, Brian, that it's reminiscent of SendMail, right? Nobody adopted SendMail; they adopted AOL and CompuServe, right? So it's you know, the protocol. Let's get the identity thing done, for God's sake. It's been too long, right? Let's just get her done. It's time. We've had 5 years fooling around. We got to get it done. Corporate identity, individual identity, and how they relate to each other. I think we're on the way, but man, I just wish that had gone faster. But then people have got to get excited about building cool stuff on that. And there's so much to be built, and that's where the adoption is going to come.
I wouldn't say no one implemented SendMail. I mean, I've got.
They implemented, but you didn't. As a user, you didn't know that it was SendMail.
No, I do want to make a plug for something called Mail in a Box, which is a script put together by Josh Taubman, who, if anyone knows out there, is a really great hacker who allows you to take either a system image up in DigitalOcean, or a server in DigitalOcean or some other cloud host, or even a Raspberry Pi, which is what I did, and run one script from a command line, and it installs your mail transfer agent, installs the POP and IMAP client, and does all of the DNS magic as well to get that all to be secure. It's an incredible piece of work, and it allows people to run their own mail servers, even if they're not at like that pinnacle that you need to be right now from a systems admin to be able to put all the pieces together yourself. It's probably still something only 1 in 1,000 people know how to do, perhaps, out there, but if that 1 in 1,000 can provide it for their neighborhood, right, can provide it for their network, or if we come up with blockchain-based ways of running, the decentralized server kind of repos, I think we can get closer to that way of federating it out. But it's got to be simple to use and install. I do have to say I put more of my hat on enterprise, perhaps, than some of you. What the history of open standards and then open source really showed is you might not ever be able to convince the number one in a market to launch an open source project that commoditizes their core IP, right? Who would do that? But generally, you can argue, you can approach competitors 2 through N to organize themselves around that kind of thing. Not to talk about it in an antitrust point of view, but you know what I'm talking about. And that was true for standards. That was true for open source, and I think that's true for open networks and blockchain networks in particular. And I think we all see that the adoption by enterprises of blockchain technology out there, and it's a substantive thing. It's hard to put your finger on and quantify sometimes, but there are the use cases are growing all the time, and that movement is really there. And I think there it's easier to talk about adoption. I think for the consumers, they still want that kind of the the end experience to be kind of more managed by somebody like an Apple App Store or a Google Store, that sort of thing. To this point, the mass audiences, but maybe things will get so just nasty in the social networking world that it'll drive a lot of demand for alternatives, as it has for Signal and others. And so I think that those two meet up at some point between now and 2030.
Yeah, the App Store fight that Epic is leading, and you know, Apple's giving us some grief right now at Brave, is real, and I think that's going to flare up, and it's not going to scale. So there has to be some better decentralized way. But I think most users are still at the verified email, you know, recover your password, reset your password path, and to go from there to, you know, identity wallets and pseudonymity is a pretty big jump. You know, are we all going to carry hardware keys? I have one on me. It's hard to use.
We'll have custodians for our keys, the way that we have mail hosts. You know, the custodians should give us more portability rather than locking us into a data processor of, you know, Facebook, that sort of thing. Give us one step more removed, but allow us to recover when we lose our phone in the toilet or something like that.
I'm storing mine in my Neuralink right here.
We're running out of time here. Just a quick fire last round. What is the one thing we think we'll see in 2030 that we don't have today on the internet? Very quickly.
I think we'll have a website. We'll have websites that are controlled by a community instead of by an individual. Like this concept of like much more, you know, DAOs are I think almost there, but we'll have, you know, full control go to the community, where you could have thousands of people managing an application instead of any one.
Great. Brendan?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we'll have governance. I'm not rushing into the space, but I think you'll see more governance on chain, and there'll be some amazing disasters along the way.
John?
Oh, I think we're gonna, in 2030, we'll have more humans causing more humans plenty of trouble with the tools that we've given them, and so more of the same, but it'll feel different in some ways. But yeah, I have faith in the ability of humans to find ways of playing shenanigans.
Brian?
I'll tell you what I hope is still there, which is I hope the Internet Archive is still there. I hope the Wikipedia is still there. I hope we have a search engine. Hopefully we can get away from a search engine that's attached to one vendor and is something that is much more federated, decentralized, without being corruptible as well. But I think there's some key institutions that I worry we're at risk of losing in 10 years if we don't curate and pay attention to them. So I'm sorry to invert the question, but that's that.
That's quite okay. So thanks very, very much to all of you, and thanks for tuning in, everybody. And we'll have some more CoinDesk Lives in the future. We have another event on September the 30th that we're calling CoinDesk U, which is all about student university education. Thanks very much, everybody.